Hey, everybody. Good to see you all. Please let me know in the comment section if there's any difficulty hearing and seeing me. Want to talk about the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 and the various perspectives that there are about who is the suffering servant. So we're going to talk about what do Jews say about this? And of course, what does the New Testament say? And what do even atheists say about it? I want to take a look at all of the perspectives. And by the way, I do want to remind you of something that is going on next month. I am going to be offering a course on the history of the development of the doctrine of the Trinity from the Bible to Nicaea 1. Technically, it'll actually be Constantinople 1, but that doesn't have as nice of a ring to it unless people know Constantinople 1. So we're just going to say Nicaea-ish. A history of the doctrine of the Trinity. So we're going to be talking about this just as a way of historical theology and an observation of the conversation on the development of this doctrine. And this is for everybody, atheists, Jews, Christians of all stripes, so Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, everybody will benefit from this. And so if you're interested in that, go to rtcourses.com and check out the course that you'll see right there on the homepage, From the Bible to Nicaea 1, and go ahead and sign up. That's going to be on the 22nd of next month. I'll be offering those lectures live, although of course, just as a reminder, you don't have to attend live. It's good if you do, because there is a Q&A, but you don't have to, because once you purchase access to it, you always have it'll always be available on demand. And also, right now there's a early bird special, so make sure to check it out again, rtcourses.com. Let's go ahead and dive into the topic at hand, because it's a fair amount of ground to cover here. Let's just maybe rehearse our knowledge of what the New Testament says about the identity of the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. And maybe let me also just start out by explaining Isaiah 53 in general, and also what got me interested in this. Isaiah 53 is one of those passages that is often, probably most often, brought up in discussions between Christians and Jews. And I got really interested in it whenever I wanted to start doing apologetics towards Jews. And I asked the question, okay, well, how do I prove to a Jew that Jesus is the Messiah? What passage would I go to in the Old Testament? And so that was kind of the initial motivation that got me into the conversation and researching this question. I mean, obviously, I've been familiar with the passage for quite some time. I mean, I've read the Bible cover to cover over 10 times. I have, of course, the first time I ever read the Bible was in 1 month. And that was 2006, right around there. So I've been doing theology and studying the Bible and theology for about 20 years now. I'm getting old. You can start to see the gray hairs here. So obviously I've been familiar with it for a very long time. But, when you start doing apologetics, it brings you into a different level. What you thought you previously knew, you don't know that well, and you find out you don't know it very well. Because whenever you're having conversations with people that don't share your convictions or presuppositions and assumptions, you get challenged and you have to prove your position. You have to show your work, if you will, to use mathematic terminology, right? So you have to really do the heavy lifting at that point, and it forces you to examine the thing more carefully. Anybody who has ever taught something knows this. If you've taught theology before, you find out how very, very, very quickly how little you know about theology, because now you got to explain it. I remember first time I probably encountered that was teaching a confirmation class, right? So I'm teaching younger people about the Trinity and stuff like that, or confirmation and the sacraments, and you have to be able to explain it to somebody who is starting from scratch, and that's when you have to really get into it, right? And of course, teaching as an adjunct professor, you have to really understand the subject matter at a level that you just don't have if you're not teaching it. So again, anybody who's ever taught knows this. Well, that's kind of what I encountered here. I had already known a fair amount about Isaiah 53, but when you're put into the position that you have to convince a skeptic, then you have to start thinking of how will they read this? How will they perceive it? How do they understand it? And, I asked a lot of questions like, okay, well, there's these prophecies in the Old Testament that point to Jesus as the Messiah. Why is it that, a plain reading of the text doesn't just immediately convince most Jews? What's going on here? Obviously, they're reading it in some other way. They're interpreting it in some other way. How is it that they're interpreting or reading Isaiah 53 specifically? And so that's what I began to encounter. And so I want to take a look at it, especially from the Christian versus Jewish perspectives, but also bring in some atheists into the conversation as well, because of course they have their observations on the matter that often actually aligns more with the Jewish perspective than the Christian one. And from my observation, the Muslim perspective often aligns more with the Christian perspective, not with the Jewish and not with the atheist perspective. Okay. So let's maybe just rehearse our awareness of what the New Testament says about Isaiah 53. Of course, Isaiah 53, and arguably this pericope or section from Isaiah, at least this immediate section, actually starts in Isaiah 52, towards the latter part of Isaiah 52. So you really need to start with Isaiah 52 and read to the end of Isaiah 53 to understand this particular pericope. But Isaiah 53 discusses this figure, the servant of God, and the servant is suffering. They're going through a great deal of suffering in Isaiah 52 to 53. This is not the first time the servant is mentioned. There are other chapters in Isaiah where the servant is explicitly identified. But in this particular pericope, they're suffering, and hence the moniker suffering servant, right? So how does the New Testament interpret these passages? So if you look at Mark 10, Jesus says, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, that language certainly echoes Isaiah 53. So you can say that Mark is certainly alluding to the suffering servant explicitly, or specifically, I should say, in Isaiah 53. You also have Matthew 8, 16 through 17, that quotes Isaiah 53, 4 specifically. He took our infirmities and bore our diseases. And it says that Jesus fulfilled this through his healing ministry. So Matthew applies that passage to Jesus. John 12, 37 through 38 quotes Isaiah 53, 1. Who has believed our report, Isaiah says. And he quotes that to explain why many people didn't believe in Jesus. Acts 8, 26 through 35, that section tells the story, of course, of the Ethiopian eunuch. And it ties it into Isaiah 53 when the Ethiopian asks who the passage refers to. Philip the evangelist, who's evangelizing the Ethiopian eunuch, explains it refers to Jesus. So you have that being Isaiah 53 being tied into Acts. Romans 10:16 quotes Isaiah 53, 1. So you have that in the Pauline literature. 1 Peter 2, 21 through 25. So the Catholic epistles contains the most extensive application, really, of Isaiah 53, quoting, he committed no sin, by his wounds you've been healed, he bore our sins. So you certainly have that being referred to there. And of course, lastly, in Luke 22, 37, Jesus quotes Isaiah 53, 12, which says, he was numbered with the transgressors. And then Luke says this scripture must be fulfilled in me. So Jesus in Luke says the scriptures fulfilled in him. Okay, so very, very clearly, there's just an abundance here in the Gospels and the Pauline literature, the Catholic epistles. When it comes to the New Testament perspective, Jesus is the suffering servant. Now, is he exclusively the suffering servant? That's a question that should be asked, right? Is Jesus, per the New Testament, exclusively the suffering servant? One might argue no, but certainly Jesus is highlighted most frequently as the suffering servant. But when I say not necessarily exclusively per the New Testament, what am I referring to? So this might shock a lot of people. A lot of people don't realize it. Paul, the Apostle Paul, sees himself as the servant of Isaiah. That doesn't mean he doesn't also see Jesus as the suffering servant. It can be a both and, right? But at least according to Acts, and obviously a lot of scholars argue that Acts is actually not consistent with the Pauline epistles, and whoever wrote Acts actually contradicts it. Many times you'll see atheists like Bart Ehrman arguing that. So there's a huge conversation there. But Acts in Acts 13, 46 through 47 has Paul explicitly applying Isaiah 49, 1 through 6, which is about the servant, and applies it to himself and actually also Barnabas. So you got Jesus, who's certainly identified as a suffering servant in the New Testament, and also, again, arguably in the Pauline literature. But then Paul, per Acts, also applies the passages of the servant, specifically Isaiah 49, not 53, but it's still the same servant in Isaiah. It's not, you don't have different servants here. But he applies that to himself and also Barnabas as they're being persecuted in their missionary ventures. And so there's that plot twist that a lot of people often miss there, is that Paul has that going on there. And, you know, a lot of people, the way they've understood this as well, this is effectively the body of Christ manifesting the same characteristics as the head of the church, as Jesus himself. And so often the things that are applied to the head of the body are then applied by extension to the mystical body. So there's often that theologizing of these things that goes on, right? Okay, so let me also pull up some other ones here. Got a lot for you. Let's look at some of the responses or perspectives of the Jewish community. And it's not just limited to the Jewish community. It's also often atheists and agnostics, or non-Christians and non-Muslims who will bring forward these observations. And admittedly, there's some truth to them, right? And I think you'll see that here in a second. How does a Jew understand the suffering servant of Isaiah? You know, if you've ever spoken to a Jew and you've opened up Isaiah 52, 53, and you ask them, who is this? What 9 times out of 10 is going to be the response you're going to get? They're going to argue that Israel is the suffering servant. And okay, look, there are plenty of references in Isaiah itself that identifies the suffering servant as Israel. Of course, the way that's often understood in Christian theology is that Jesus is the embodiment of Israel and is the ultimate representative of Israel. So it's kind of a both and, not an either or. So it's not excluded from the Christian paradigm. But what you would see usually a Jew doing is saying, well, this applies to the nation of Israel, not just one individual in Israel. So Isaiah 41, 8 through 9 says this: but you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, blah, 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 blah. You see very clearly Isaiah 51 identifies this servant figure that's mentioned many times in Isaiah explicitly as Israel. And then it says Jacob. And by the way, Jacob's name is also, again, Israel. Isaiah 44:1. But now hear, O Jacob, my servant Israel, whom I've chosen. Very explicit there. Isaiah 44:21. Remember these things, O Jacob and Israel, for you are my servant. I formed you. You are my servant, O Israel. You will not be forgotten by me. Isaiah 45:4. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen. I called you by your name. I name you, though you do not know me. Isaiah 48:20. Go out from Babylon, flee from Chaldea. Declare this with a shout of joy. Proclaim it. Send it out to the ends of the earth. Say, the Lord has redeemed his servant Jacob. Again, Jacob is Israel. Isaiah 49:3. And he said to me, you are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Okay, so very, very clearly, many references there to Israel as a suffering servant. I also want to read a few other Old Testament passages that I think Jews will often point out to identify who this servant, and specifically the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 is outside of Isaiah. So how does the Old Testament interpret Isaiah 53? Well, if you look at Zephaniah 3:12 through 13, a book that's often overlooked in the Minor Prophets, but it actually takes Isaiah 53:9 and it applies it to Israel. So how does Zephaniah, the prophet Zephaniah, understand Isaiah? Zephaniah, the Old Testament, interprets Isaiah as Israel. It says explicitly, and I will leave in the midst of thee an afflicted and poor people. In fact, let me bring it up on the screen so y'all can see, because I don't think you can see right now. Let me share my screen here. Let's see here. Hold on. Share screen. There we go. Okay. Zephaniah 3:12 through 13. But I will leave within you the meek and humble, the remnant of Israel will trust in the name of the Lord. They will do no wrong, they will tell no lies. A deceitful tongue will not be found in their mouths. They will eat and lie down, and no one will make them afraid. Okay, so it's talking about Israel, and specifically a remnant of Israel. So not all of Israel, but a remnant. A remnant is a minority. What remnant specifically? Righteous Israel, right? The few remnant who are not only preserved through the Babylonian captivity, but also maintain worship of the one true God of Israel. But notice Israel, it said of Israel, they will do no wrong. They will tell no lies. A deceitful tongue will not be found in their mouths. That is very clearly a reference to Isaiah 53:9, which, again, says this. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Now, you'll notice the difference is, here, at least in this part of Isaiah 53, it's the singular, whereas in Zephaniah, it's the plural. But the reality of Isaiah is, Isaiah speaks of the suffering servant in both the plural and in the singular. So you can't make too much about this. And I'll often see this in apologetics. Dr. Michael Brown, in a lot of his debates, will, try to argue that, well, it has to be Jesus. It can't be the nation of Israel or a remnant of Israel, because in Isaiah 53, the suffering servant is spoken of in the singular. Not a very good argument, because The servant is also referred to both in the singular and in the plural in Isaiah itself. And an observant student of Isaiah would know that. For example, Isaiah 43:10. Let me maybe share that on my screen with you. Should be able to see it right around now. You are my witnesses, declares Yahweh, and my servant, whom I have chosen, so that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me, no God was formed, nor will there be after me. You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant. Witnesses is plural. Servant is singular, but it's referring to the same reference, right? And so you can't make too much of that. You would have to actually argue it's a both and, that the suffering servant can be spoken of in the plural use and also in the singular use. By the way, this is something you find in Daniel 7 as well. Just as a quick side note here, let me just show you the Son of Man figure in Daniel 7 is spoken of both in the singular and in the plural. And it says right here, let's go to verse 9. Thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. Hair on his head was white like a wool. River of fire was flowing, coming out of him. Before him, thousands of thousands attended him, tens of thousands times, tens of thousands. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words of the horn that was speaking. In my vision at night, I looked, and there was before me one like a son of man, coming in the clouds of heaven. And the idea of coming on the clouds of heaven, the rider of heaven, is something you find very often with references to the god Baal in the Old Testament. And you often find that imagery of Baal being applied to Yahweh. And in fact, that's why you'll find, David naming his children names after Baal, and Baal in the actual name. And then you'll find the chronicler, I think, changing the name of David's son to a derivation of the word Eli, because he's trying to get away from the name Baal. But often Yahweh and Baal can sometimes be synonyms, just because Baal could generically mean Lord, but at other times it can refer to that specific pagan deity, and so distinct from Yahweh. In fact, I did a whole video talking about that, but side note to the side note there. Anyways, he approached the Ancient of Days, so he's distinct from the Ancient of Days. But notice it's singular, right? A son of man, he approached the Ancient of Days. But then he interprets for you who the Son of Man is in Daniel. And so Daniel was troubled in spirit at the things he was just shown. So the angel came to him, and he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. So how does the angel interpret who the Son of Man is? I mean, setting aside the conversation of how the New Testament interprets the Son of Man, the New Testament will apply the Son of Man to Jesus, right? But what does Daniel do here in the angel interpreting who the Son of Man is? The four great beasts are four great kings, but the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and possess it forever and ever. Yes, forever and ever. Now, hold on. Who receives the kingdom? In verse 14, it's the Son of Man. His dominion is everlasting. His kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So the Son of Man in the singular receives the kingdom. According to Daniel, however, what is the interpretation of these things? The people of the Most High will receive the kingdom. Who's the people of the Most High? Israel. So according to Daniel, who is the Son of Man? Israel. The people of Israel. But again, often you have this theme of, the collective people of Israel is how these things are interpreted in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, you have an application of those things specifically to the most righteous of Israel, being Jesus. Okay. But here you see that exact same theme. you have the plural and the singular for the Son of Man, and it refers to Israel, at least according to the Old Testament. Same exact thing going on with the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. It's spoken of in the singular, but then it's elsewhere identified in the plural and then identified as the remnant, righteous Israel. And so that's how also Zephaniah understands it. But it's not just Zephaniah. Let's go to another one here. Let's go to Lamentations 5:7. I think of Conan the Barbarian every time I hear of Lamentations, right? The lamentation of the women. Our ancestors sinned and are no more, and we bear their punishment. The idea here of bearing punishment and atoning for iniquity that you have there in Isaiah 53. From a Jewish perspective, a Jewish person would say righteous and the remnant of Israel, righteous Israel, atoned for the iniquities of idolatrous Israel. So the remnant coming out of Babylon atoned for the iniquity of unrighteous Israel that went into Babylon and went into Babylon because of idolatry. So a Jew will often point to passages like this. It says, our ancestors sinned and are no more. And we, who's we? We in the context is righteous and the remnant of Israel, righteous Israel. And we bear their punishment. We bear their iniquity. Again, an allusion there to Isaiah 53, where the suffering servant bears the iniquities of Israel. So if you were to point to, okay, well, look, Jesus on the cross paid for our sins. So he's the one who bore our iniquities. I mean, that's what the New Testament explicitly says. The Jew is just going to come back and say, yeah, that's an interesting interpretation, but according to the Old Testament itself, the text that we're using, it interprets the remnant of Israel as bearing those punishments and iniquities. And so that's often what you'll see from a Jewish perspective. These things are not, unknown, obviously, to New Testament commentators. You can find, for example, the Revised Standard Bible Oxford Study Edition has an interesting comment on Isaiah 53 and also just the servant in general in Isaiah. And it points out some of these things. I'll read a quote to you from the Oxford Study Edition. The fourth servant song, the suffering servant, Israel, the servant of God. So it identifies the suffering servant. And this is again, a Christian commentary, right? This isn't Jewish per se. The suffering servant it identifies as Israel, has suffered as a humiliated individual, because again, in Isaiah 53, you do have that singular use of the servant. However, the servant endured without complaint because it was vicarious suffering. Isaiah 52, 13 through 15. Nations and kings will be surprised to see the servant exalted. Isaiah 53, 1. The crowds, pagan nations among whom the servant Israel lived, speak here through verse 9, saying that the significance of Israel's humiliation and exaltation is hard to believe. So what is this New Testament, again, Christian commentary doing with Isaiah 53? It's saying, well, these things are fulfilled in the remnant of Israel and the exaltation of Israel. Is it denying the New Testament interpretation of applying these things to Jesus? No, I don't think it's denying it. I think the commentary is arguing it's a both and. So I think the commentary is arguing the Jews are right and the New Testament is right. I think the difficulty from what I saw from the Muslim perspective with that kind of double fulfillment, I think a Muslim apologist or scholar or theologian would just say, okay, you often have that dynamic of the New Testament having like a double fulfillment in application of those things in the Old Testament and applying them to Jesus. In the case of Paul claiming that he and Barnabas are the suffering servant, you might have a tertiary fulfillment. So the initial fulfillment is Isaiah, the second fulfillment and ultimate would be Jesus, and then a tertiary fulfillment in Paul and Barnabas. I've seen, from what I could tell from the Muslim scholars, they would just say, if you're willing to admit a secondary and even a tertiary fulfillment, then you can do that with the Son of Man passages and the suffering servant and apply those to Muhammad. And what's to stop you then from applying often those passages that often are applied to Jesus in the New Testament? What's to stop you from then applying them also to Muhammad as a double or even tertiary fulfillment? So those are the responses that I usually see. And it's kind of similar to what often a Jew is going to say on these passages. They're going to say, well, look, the Old Testament interprets these passages as Israel. What you're doing coming along with the New Testament is you're trying to say there's a double fulfillment. The problem there is, they would argue, that is the Jew, is that you're saying there's no sense in which the plain reading of the text in the primary or initial fulfillment of these things is actually Jesus the Messiah. I think there was a pope who condemned that perspective, by the way. I don't recall offhand, but I think there was a pope that did condemn the perspective that anyone who says that like there's no sense in which the primary fulfillment or initial fulfillment truly speaks of Jesus, that view is condemned. But if somebody knows a reference, please let me know. I'll need to go back and look at it. But aside from that, maybe a Protestant or an Orthodox would be happy to admit that, okay, well, maybe these things are secondary fulfillments in Jesus and the primary fulfillment is Israel. But I don't know if that interpretation can really be admitted from a Catholic paradigm in light of the Pope that I'm thinking of here. But I'll need to go back and look at it. Okay. A lot more to cover here. Let's see. This is, by the way, from Bart Ehrman. So this is an agnostic, right? This is somebody who is he atheist or agnostic? I think he's agnostic. So this is somebody who's not committed to any religious convictions. But he says this. In this case, the author is not predicting that someone will suffer in the future for other people's sins at all. So he's arguing Isaiah 53 is not actually a prophecy. It's not a future prediction, but it's actually something that already happened. Many readers fail to consider the verb tenses that are found in these passages. They do not indicate that someone will come along at a later time and suffer in the future. They are talking about past suffering. The servant has already suffered, although he will be vindicated. And so this is not about a future suffering Messiah. If the passage is not referring to the Messiah and is not referring to someone in the future who is going to suffer, who is it talking about? Here, there really should be very little ambiguity. As I mentioned, this particular passage, Isaiah 53, is one of 4 suffering servant songs of second Isaiah. He maintains the position. I think he might believe in 3 authors to Isaiah, but most scholars argue that at least there's 2 authors to Isaiah. So that's who he's referring to there. Second Isaiah would be the second author of Isaiah. And so the question is, who does second Isaiah himself indicate that the servant is? A careful reading of the passages makes the identification very clear. But now hear, O Jacob, my servant, Israel, whom I have chosen, Isaiah 44:1. Remember these things, O Jacob and Israel, for you are my servant, Isaiah 44:21. And he said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified, Isaiah 49:3. So he's kind of going a little bit more with the Jewish interpretation that the servant is Israel and is righteous Israel. And he's adding the point that this is not a future prophecy, but the suffering servant is someone who already suffered. So in other words, the remnant of Israel, righteous remnant of Israel, is already suffering, but will later be vindicated, presumably when it comes out of exile from Babylon. So that part is future. So that's how he reads the text. So he's going to say that the interpretation that Jesus is the suffering servant made by the New Testament is not what Isaiah intended and is not the natural reading of Isaiah. Okay, he did mention there the question about the suffering servant and whether or not the servant is also the Messiah. By the way, what does Messiah mean? Messiah means anointed one. What does that mean? Anointed. Anointed is whenever there's an application of some kind of usually oil or some kind of liquid applied to a person. So if you look at the Old Testament, the anointed one is usually the king, although I believe also priests and prophets had anointings at various times as well. But usually it's associated with the king. So Saul anoints. Did I say Saul? Saul is anointed by Samuel. So Samuel anoints Saul king over Israel. David is anointed king, and they apply. There's this application of oil on their head. You can see that most recently in the coronation of the King of England. There was that anointing part where the oil was applied to him. I think they did it behind a cover, but they anointed him a king. So the Messiah was going to be somebody who would be anointed king of Israel. After Israel loses its kingdom and goes into exile, there's this prophecy or claim that there will be a future king who will reign over Israel and free them from the tyranny of their enemies. And so that's what Messiah means. And so there's many Messiahs in the Old Testament, small m, but many began to interpret and argue for a future Messiah who would be like this ultimate king to reign over Israel. So then the question is, when it comes to the suffering servant, is the suffering servant the same as the Messiah, this anointed king, the future king of Israel, who will rule over Israel and free them from the tyranny of their oppressors? And by the way, it's not just the kingly aspect that we can have in the conversation of the Messiah. Isaiah also talks about this figure healing the blind, curing the sick, casting out demons and stuff like that, that Jesus applies to himself as evidence that he's as evidence that the kingdom of God has come and that he's the Messiah. Okay, but you do have that kingly aspect. So then the question is the suffering servant the same as the Messiah? So you can see Isaiah 43 perhaps answers that question. Let's maybe take a look at it. Isaiah 43:10. You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, so that you may know and believe in me and understand that I am he. Notice that the servant is chosen. Some would argue that is a reference to being anointed. Isaiah 41:8 could also be considered. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, you descendants of Abraham, my friend. Some might argue that that's also an allusion to chosenness of the Messiah. Again, some might contest this. However, there's a little bit more to consider. If you look at Targum Jonathan, so Targum Jonathan, as it's often called, Targum, kind of a loose paraphrase, if you will, ancient paraphrase on the Old Testament. If you look at the Targum on Isaiah 52:13, it says, behold, my servant Messiah shall prosper. He shall be high and increase and be exceedingly strong. So there in the Targum, at least, you have a connection between the servant of Isaiah 52 and 53 with Messiah, with anointed one, with the chosen one. And a lot of people will point to that, right? You do have to keep in mind there's a little bit more to it from the Targum, however, because if you want to selectively like pull that out and say, you see Isaiah 53 is about Jesus because it's talking about the Messiah as an individual. That's an interesting observation, but then you have to look at the very next part of the Targum, which is on verse 14 of Isaiah 52. And it says this: as the house of Israel looked to him during many days, because their countenance was darkened among the peoples and their complexion darkened beyond the sons of men. The house of Israel there. And then it says elsewhere in the same Targum, but it is the Lord's good pleasure to refine and cleanse the remnant of his people in order to purify their souls from sin. They shall see the kingdom of the Messiah. They shall increase their sons and daughters. They shall prolong their days. And those whom perform the law of the Lord shall prosper in good pleasure. And what you'll see Jews like Tobias Singer do is they'll say, well, that Messiah reference has to be understood in the context of the Targums that often applies these things to the collective remnant of Israel. Now, you could still argue it's a both and. That it refers to the collective remnant of Israel and to the Messiah as the embodiment of righteous Israel. So you could still do the both and thing. Again, I think what the Muslim would probably say in response to this, or even an atheist would say, if you're going to do a both and, you can do the both and with Muhammad as well, or someone else, right? Someone outside of the Islamic faith, perhaps the Baha'i faith or something like that. Maybe Joseph Smith from the Mormon faith. Okay, so that is something to consider. Now, there's maybe one other thing that we should take a look at, and I noticed this from Dr. Ali Attai, who is a Muslim scholar, and by the way, I've had him on the show multiple times. And he's talked a lot about the suffering servant and the question of Isaiah 53. And he brought out a point that I had not heard of before. And maybe I should have noticed this before. I guess I wasn't carefully reading Jeremiah because he pulled this out from Jeremiah. And evidently Jeremiah sees himself as the suffering servant. That doesn't mean that Jeremiah saw himself exclusively as a suffering servant. I don't get any indication where he says like exclusively these things apply to me or something like that. But Jeremiah does apply the suffering servant figure to himself. So, for example, Jeremiah 11:9. Let's take a look at that. Let me pull it up and share my screen. So if you want to talk about the singular use of Isaiah, here's where probably a Jew is going to come back and say, well, all right, you want to say it's a both and we can speak of it as a collective suffering servant and also an individual suffering servant. The Jew is just going to say, but that doesn't have to be Jesus as the Messiah. If we're going to speak of this in an individual sense, it could be the individual righteous Jew, or it could even be Jeremiah. And here's where they would get that from. Jeremiah 11:19. You should be able to see it. I had been like a gentle lamb led to the slaughter, nor did I realize that they had plotted against me, saying, let us destroy the tree and its fruit. Let us cut him off from the land of the living, that his name be remembered no more. So two references there to Isaiah 53. Lamb led to the slaughter. Remember, that's applied to Jesus in the New Testament. Here it's applied to Jeremiah. Lamb led to the slaughter, cut off from the land of the living. Both of those are references and actually quotes from Isaiah 53. Compare this with Isaiah 53, 7 through 8. Okay. he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. That's applied to Jesus in the New Testament. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. Okay, so there it is. That's applied to Jesus in the New Testament. It's also applied to Jeremiah in the Old Testament. And as a sheep before its shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. So there it is. Very, very clearly, those two concepts there. Did not open his mouth, cut off from the land of the living, which is in verse 8. He was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people was he punished. By the oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? Okay, those two concepts back to back. Cut off from the land of the living, did not open his mouth. Well, you have that right there being applied to Jeremiah, those two things, in Jeremiah 11:19. Okay, so a Jew is probably going to say, if you want to focus on a singular use of the suffering servant, they're going to say it doesn't have to be Jesus. It could just be Jeremiah, or it could be any individual righteous servant of Israel. And they would say in the Old Testament, it's the righteous Israelite who expiates the sins of the collective whole, and therefore you don't need an atonement on the cross and all this and that. That's usually what I've seen from the Jewish apologetic, and so they're going to highlight and focus on those. Again, from the New Testament perspective, you can say it's all the above. Now you would have a fourth fulfillment of who the suffering servant is, though. You would have Israel, Jeremiah, Jesus, and then Paul and Barnabas. So like reading these things and applying them fourfold. Again, the Muslims just going to come say, why can't you do 5 times? Just apply it to Muhammad. Or a Mormon could probably argue, although I don't think a Mormon is going to say that Joseph Smith was the suffering servant whenever he was shot at the end of his life. But you know what I mean, right? Somebody could come along and say, well, this applies to my prophet, or this applies to my religious figure. And so if you have these kinds of double, triple, quad fulfillments, how would you even describe that for a fourth fulfillment? Why can't you have a fifth or something like that, right? Okay, so these are all the things to keep in mind when having these conversations. And to answer the question that I originally investigated, I wanted to know, why is it that Jews don't just completely like become a Christian the next day when they read Isaiah 52 to 53? I found out the answer. The way they read it is they'll just point to passages of the Old Testament that says this applies to Jesus. I'm sorry, this applies to Israel. This applies to the righteous remnant left in Israel coming out of the exile, or this applies to Jeremiah. And they'll just say those things are already fulfilled in Israel, therefore we don't need Jesus as the Messiah. So here's the thing. Can you read it as consistent with the New Testament? Yes, of course. I think you can. You just go with the double, triple, quad fulfillment. Like you just go with multiple fulfillments. Can you read this consistent from a Jewish paradigm? Yes, you can. You just exclude any double fulfillment and just say there's only one fulfillment type of thing. This is one of the reasons why just simply maybe pointing to Isaiah 53 is not going to convince anybody who's not already convinced. So if you're going and you're attempting to evangelize a Jew, a well-educated Jew is going to know these things, and it's just not going to move the needle for them. And these are the things that you'll start to learn whenever you do apologetics or teach theology or do a really deep dive into these things. You have to ask the question, how would this group read this text? And you'll find out very quickly that there's always a way to read whatever you want to read into the text. There's always a way. I had to find that out the hard way, because I used to be naive enough to think that if you just showed them the passage, if you just showed, this group that they'll see the truth and accept it. I learned pretty quickly that that's not necessarily the case for most people. People will often just interpret things in accordance with their pre-existing paradigm, and they will find a way to find an interpretation that reinforces it. This is one of the reasons why I don't find as much utility to a lot of the apologetic content that is out there as much as I previously thought these things were significant, because I learned that in a lot of these discussions and debates, every side is just going to find a reason to reinforce their current perspective and they'll come up with some clever argument to do it. And I've seen some very clever arguments to reinforce whatever your paradigm is. So anyways, those are the things that maybe to keep in mind when having these conversations with people of different perspectives. I hope you found it helpful and productive. Again, make sure to check out the course that I'm going to be offering on the development of the doctrine of the Trinity. We're going to do a historical theology examination, how the doctrine develops in history. It's open to everybody, so make sure to check it out, rtcourses.com. Hope to see you all there. And of course, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. We'll see you later.